February 2nd, 1943, the city of Stalingrad. Lieutenant Hans Urtel of the German 6th Army sat in a frozen basement with 12 other soldiers. They had no food, no ammunition, no hope. Outside, Soviet soldiers were calling for surrender through loudspeakers. The message repeated in German. "The battle is over. Your commanders have abandoned you. Surrender, and you will be treated according to international law." Urtel wrote in his diary, "We don't believe them about the treatment, but we have no choice. We can either freeze to death here or take our chances. At least as prisoners, there's a possibility of survival." He was wrong about that possibility. Of the 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad in those final days of January and early February 1943, only 6,000 would ever see Germany again. The rest would die in Soviet captivity over the next decade, from disease, starvation, exhaustion, cold, and despair. This is their story, not the story of the battle itself, which has been told many times. This is the story of what happened after the shooting stopped, the story of a death march into Siberia, of prison camps where men died by the hundreds each day, of slave labor building Soviet infrastructure, of broken men who survived years only to die weeks before liberation. This is the story of 85,000 men who never came home. To understand what happened to these men, we need to understand the desperate situation they faced in January 1943. The German 6th Army, commanded by Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, had been encircled in Stalingrad since November 22nd, 1942. Hitler had forbidden retreat, promising that Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe would supply the army by air. That promise had proven impossible to keep. By January 1943, the 6th Army was dying. Soldiers were receiving 1/3 of minimum rations. Horses had been eaten. Anything burnable had been burned. Men were freezing to death at their posts. Wounded soldiers lay in basements with no medical supplies, gangrene spreading through frost-bitten limbs. The German defensive perimeter was collapsing. Soviet forces had split the pocket in two. Communication between units was breaking down. The situation was beyond hopeless. It was catastrophic. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. The message was clear. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to fight to the death or commit suicide. Paulus chose differently. On January 31st, he surrendered his headquarters. On February 2nd, the last German units in Stalingrad laid down their arms. The numbers were staggering. Approximately 91,000 German and Axis soldiers went into Soviet captivity. They included 2,500 officers, 24 generals, and 1 field marshal. These men represented the remnants of an army that had numbered over 250,000 just 3 months earlier. But here's what most people don't understand. These weren't healthy soldiers surrendering. These were walking skeletons. Most weighed less than 100 pounds. Many couldn't walk without support. Frostbite had claimed fingers, toes, ears, noses. Dysentery had ravaged their digestive systems. Typhus was epidemic. A Soviet officer named Anatoly Mareshko, who witnessed the surrender, later wrote, "I expected to see German soldiers. Instead, I saw ghosts." Men who looked like they'd already died, but hadn't realized it yet. Some could barely stand. Others sat in the snow, too weak to move, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. The surrender itself was chaotic. Some German units surrendered in good order, with officers maintaining discipline. Others simply collapsed where they stood. Some soldiers tried to destroy their weapons before surrendering. Others handed them over with relief, glad the fighting was finally over. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had fought in Stalingrad for months, had mixed reactions. Some felt pity for these defeated enemies. Others felt satisfaction, remembering what the Germans had done to Soviet cities and soldiers. A few felt nothing at all, just exhaustion and a desire to go home. The Soviets were unprepared for the sheer number of prisoners. They had expected perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 survivors. Instead, they got 91,000. The logistics of handling that many prisoners, feeding them, housing them, transporting them, overwhelmed Soviet capabilities. And that's where the dying truly began. The first challenge was simply getting the prisoners out of Stalingrad. The city was a frozen wasteland of rubble. There was no food, no shelter, no transportation infrastructure. The prisoners would have to march. But march where? The nearest prison camps were hundreds of miles away, and these men, already on the edge of death, would have to walk there. The death marches from Stalingrad began in early February 1943. Columns of German prisoners, guarded by Soviet troops, stumbled westward and northward through the frozen steppe. The conditions were indescribable. Temperatures ranged from -20 to -30 degrees Celsius. The prisoners wore whatever rags they still had. Most had long since traded their warm clothing for food. They had no winter boots, no gloves, no proper coats. Food was almost non-existent. The Soviet guards themselves were on reduced rations. There was simply nothing to give the prisoners. Men received perhaps 200 to 300 calories per day, a sixth of what a resting person needs, let alone someone marching through snow. Water was scarce. Men ate snow, which gave them diarrhea, which dehydrated them further, which made them eat more snow. It was a death spiral. The marches covered 20 to 40 kilometers per day. For healthy soldiers, this would be manageable. For men who weighed 90 pounds and hadn't eaten a real meal in months, it was torture. Men fell constantly. At first, the columns would stop, and Soviet guards would try to get the fallen soldier back on his feet. But as more and more men fell, the columns simply marched around them. Those who couldn't get up were left in the snow. Some Soviet guards shot prisoners who fell. Others simply left them. The practical result was the same. The man died, either from a bullet or from exposure within minutes. German officer Wilhelm Hoffmann kept a diary during the march. He wrote, "February 8th. We've been marching for 4 days. At least 100 men from our column have died. They fall, and we step around them. No one has the energy to help. No one has the energy to care. We're all dying. It's just a question of who dies first." The psychological toll was as brutal as the physical. These men had surrendered believing they would receive treatment according to international law. Instead, they were being marched to death. Many felt betrayed. Some felt they should have died fighting in Stalingrad rather than dying slowly in the snow. Soviet guards varied in their treatment of prisoners. Some were cruel, shooting stragglers, or beating men who moved too slowly. Others showed occasional mercy, sharing cigarettes or turning a blind eye when prisoners scavenged for food. But the cruelty often came from policy, not just individual guards. Soviet authorities viewed German prisoners as war criminals who deserved no sympathy. The suffering of the prisoners was seen as just punishment for what Germany had done to the Soviet Union. Disease spread rapidly through the columns. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, frostbite infections, all killed men by the hundreds. There was no medical care. Sick men either kept walking or they died. Some prisoners went insane. The combination of starvation, exhaustion, cold, and despair broke their minds. Men would wander away from the columns, convinced they were going home. Others would sit down in the snow and refuse to move, welcoming death. Cannibalism occurred, though how frequently is disputed. Some sources mention prisoners killing and eating the dead. Whether this actually happened or was Soviet propaganda is unclear. What is clear is that men were desperate enough that nothing would have been beyond consideration. The march destinations were transit camps, temporary facilities where prisoners would be processed before being sent to permanent labor camps. These transit camps were located in cities like Beketovka, Krasnoarmysk, and Suzdal. The journey to these camps took anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months, depending on the route and conditions. With each day of marching, more men died. By the time the columns reached the transit camps in March and April 1943, thousands had already perished. One estimate suggests that 27,000 prisoners died during the death marches, nearly 30% of those who surrendered. But for those who reached the camps, the nightmare was only beginning. The transit camps where Stalingrad prisoners were initially held were not designed to be death camps, but they functioned as such. These facilities were hastily established to process the massive influx of prisoners. They consisted of barracks, tents, or simply open fields surrounded by barbed wire. There was inadequate shelter, inadequate food, and no medical facilities worth mentioning. Camp Beketovka, one of the largest transit camps, became notorious. Prisoners called it the death camp. Between 15,000 and 20,000 prisoners passed through Beketovka. Approximately 12,000 died there. The daily death rate in March 1943 was staggering. In some camps, 300 to 500 men died every day. Bodies were stacked like cordwood outside the barracks, frozen solid, waiting for burial details to dig mass graves. Dr. Ottmar Kohler, a German military surgeon who survived Beketovka, later testified, "I've seen hospitals during epidemics. I've seen battlefield casualty stations. I've never seen anything like Beketovka. Men weren't just dying, they were decomposing while still alive. Gangrene, typhus, dysentery, starvation. We had no medicine, no instruments, no bandages. All I could do was watch them die and record their names. The causes of death were multiple and overlapping. Typhus swept through the camps in epidemic waves. The disease, spread by lice, killed thousands. Men would develop high fever, delirium, and a characteristic rash, then die within days. Dysentery was equally deadly. With no proper sanitation, the disease spread rapidly. Men would lose control of their bowels, dehydrate rapidly, and die in pools of their own waste. Starvation continued to kill. The daily ration in transit camps was barely better than on the death marches, perhaps 400 to 600 calories per day. Men who had already lost half their body weight continued wasting away. Frostbite complications killed many. Men whose extremities had frozen during the siege or the marches now developed gangrene. Without antibiotics or amputation facilities, the infection spread and killed. Psychological collapse claimed others. Men simply gave up. They would lie down on their bunks, turn their faces to the wall, and die within days. German survivors called this giving up the ghost. Soviet doctors called it dystrophy of the third degree. The camp administration was overwhelmed. Soviet authorities hadn't anticipated such massive die-offs. They hadn't prepared adequate food, medicine, or burial facilities. The system was simply collapsing under the weight of 91,000 dying men. There were occasional efforts to improve conditions. Soviet doctors were brought in to combat typhus. Food rations were slightly increased in April. Some prisoners were moved to better facilities. But these improvements came too late for tens of thousands. The damage from months of starvation, disease, and exposure couldn't be quickly reversed. Men continued dying even as conditions marginally improved. The camp hierarchy among prisoners reflected pre-surrender military rank initially. German officers received slightly better treatment and rations than enlisted men. But as death rates mounted, these distinctions became meaningless. Generals died alongside privates. Some German officers tried to maintain discipline and morale among their men. They organized work details, established sanitation routines, and tried to preserve some sense of military order. Others simply withdrew into themselves, unable to cope with their own survival guilt. The Soviet camp administrators varied in their attitudes. Some showed genuine concern for prisoner welfare and tried to improve conditions within their limited means. Others viewed the prisoners as expendable enemy combatants who deserved their fate. Political officers gave lectures about communist ideology and German war crimes. Prisoners were expected to attend these sessions, though most were too sick or apathetic to care. The Soviets were already beginning re-education efforts that would intensify in later years. By June 1943, the worst of the transit camp die-off had passed, not because conditions had dramatically improved, but because so many had already died. The survivors, perhaps 60,000 men, were being sorted and sent to permanent labor camps across the Soviet Union. But the ordeal was far from over. Starting in mid-1943, surviving Stalingrad prisoners were distributed across the vast Soviet Gulag system. They would spend years performing forced labor in mines, factories, construction sites, and forests across the USSR. The labor camps were scattered from Ukraine to Siberia, from the Arctic Circle to Central Asia. Prisoners might find themselves anywhere in the world's largest country, far from home, far from any hope of liberation. These camps operated on a simple principle: extract maximum labor from prisoners while providing minimum resources to keep them alive. The Soviet Union needed workers to replace the millions of men in the Red Army. German POWs would fill that gap. Camp conditions varied, but shared common features. Prisoners lived in wooden barracks, sleeping on bare wooden bunks with minimal blankets. Rations were tied to work performance. Those who met their labor quotas received more food. Those who didn't received starvation rations. This created a vicious cycle. Men too weak to work received less food, which made them weaker still, which meant they couldn't work, which meant less food. The system was designed to work men to death. The work itself was brutally hard. In coal mines, prisoners hacked at rock faces with primitive tools, breathing coal dust, risking cave-ins. In timber camps, they felled trees in Siberian forests, in temperatures reaching -50 degrees. In construction brigades, they built roads, railways, and factories. The daily work quota was often impossible to meet. A timber worker might be expected to cut and process several cubic meters of wood per day. A construction worker might be required to lay a certain number of bricks or move a certain tonnage of materials. Failure meant reduced rations. Helmut Waltz, who worked in a coal mine in the Donbass region, later wrote, "We went down into the mine at dawn and came up after dark. 12 hours underground, breathing dust, swinging a pickaxe. If you produced your quota, you got 600 grams of bread. If you didn't, you got 400 grams. It was impossible to survive on 400 grams, but it was almost impossible to meet the quota. Accidents were common: mining collapses, logging accidents, construction mishaps, all killed prisoners regularly. There was minimal safety equipment and no safety training. A prisoner's life had no value beyond his labor output. Medical care was minimal. Camp doctors, often prisoners themselves, had almost no supplies. They could diagnose disease, but rarely treat it. Men worked until they literally dropped, then were carried to camp infirmaries to die. The psychological impact of years in labor camps was profound. Men lost hope of ever seeing home again. Letters from Germany were rare and heavily censored. News of the war's progress barely reached the camps. Prisoners existed in a timeless void of work, hunger, and exhaustion. Some men maintained their sanity through routine and comradeship. They formed small groups, shared resources, looked after each other. These bonds sometimes meant the difference between survival and death. Others descended into apathy or madness. They became Musulmen, a term borrowed from concentration camp slang meaning walking corpses. These men moved mechanically through their work, responding to commands but essentially already dead inside. Religion became important for some prisoners. Catholic and Protestant prisoners held secret services. They drew strength from faith, believing their suffering had meaning or that God would eventually deliver them home. Others abandoned faith entirely, concluding no God would permit such suffering. The camp administration used various control methods. Guards could be brutal, beating prisoners who worked too slowly or broke rules. But the most effective control was simple hunger. Men were too weak to resist or escape. Escape attempts were rare and almost never successful. The camps were located in remote areas, hundreds or thousands of miles from any border. Escapees faced vast distances, harsh climates, hostile populations, and Soviet manhunts. Most were recaptured within days and either shot or punished with reduced rations. As the war continued, camp conditions fluctuated with Soviet fortunes. When the Red Army was advancing, there was slight optimism that the war might end soon. When Germany launched offensives, prisoners feared they might never be liberated. The arrival of winter was particularly dreaded. Men with inadequate clothing faced another cycle of frostbite and cold-related disease. Winter work quotas were as demanding as summer ones, but the cold made everything harder. Years passed. 1943 became 1944. 1944 became 1945. The war continued, and the prisoners continued dying, just more slowly than in the early months. Death rates in the labor camps were perhaps 10 to 20% per year, high, but not as catastrophic as the 50 to 60% mortality in the first 6 months. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, perhaps 45,000 Stalingrad prisoners were still alive. They had survived 3 years of hell. Many thought liberation would come quickly, now that the war was over. They were wrong. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. In labor camps across the Soviet Union, German prisoners of war celebrated cautiously, hoping this meant they would soon go home. It didn't. The Soviet Union had no intention of quickly releasing German POWs. These men represented valuable labor for post-war reconstruction. The USSR had been devastated by the war. Cities destroyed, infrastructure ruined, millions dead. German prisoners would rebuild what German armies had destroyed. Stalin made this explicit in policy. German POWs would remain in Soviet custody indefinitely, performing reparation labor. Only the sick, the elderly, or the critically injured would be considered for early repatriation. For Stalingrad survivors, this was devastating. They had survived the battle, the death marches, the transit camps, and years of labor. Now, with the war over, they remained prisoners. The post-war period brought some improvements in camp conditions. Rations increased slightly. Medical care improved marginally. Political pressure from the International Red Cross and Western allies led to some reforms. But the fundamental situation remained. German POWs were forced laborers in a system that valued their output over their lives. The work continued much as before. Prisoners built Soviet cities, mined Soviet resources, logged Soviet forests. The only difference was that now they did so in a country officially at peace. Letters from home became more regular after 1945. Prisoners learned that Germany had been divided into occupation zones. They learned of the massive destruction, the refugee crisis, the food shortages. Home no longer existed as they remembered it. Family members wrote asking when their sons, husbands, and fathers would return. Prisoners had no answer. Soviet authorities gave no timeline for repatriation. The psychological toll of indefinite captivity was severe. Men who had endured years of hardship by believing they'd go home after the war now faced the possibility they might never be released. Suicide rates increased. Men gave up hope and stopped fighting for survival. Some prisoners tried to make the best of the situation. They learned Russian, developed relationships with Soviet civilians working alongside them, tried to find meaning in their labor. A few even converted to communism, embracing the ideology of their captors. But most simply endured, day after day, year after year, waiting for release that might never come. Soviet re-education efforts intensified after the war. Prisoners attended mandatory political lectures about the evils of fascism and the virtues of communism. The Soviets were preparing some prisoners to return to Germany as supporters of communist regimes in the Soviet occupation zone. Some prisoners collaborated with these efforts, whether from genuine conviction or pragmatic survival strategy. Others resisted, maintaining their German identity and refusing to embrace Soviet ideology. In 1947, the Soviets began limited repatriation. The first prisoners released were those deemed politically reliable, plus the severely disabled who could no longer work. The numbers were small, perhaps a few hundred Stalingrad survivors in 1947. Prisoners watched as some comrades departed, wondering when their turn would come. Selection for repatriation seemed arbitrary. Some men who had been model prisoners remained in camps, while others, with worse records, were released. The cold calculation was clear. The Soviets were keeping the healthiest, strongest workers as long as possible. A prisoner who could still perform hard labor would not be released. Only when a man was too sick or injured to work would he be considered for repatriation. This created a perverse incentive. Some prisoners deliberately injured themselves or exaggerated illness, hoping to be classified as unfit for labor and sent home. Camp authorities caught on to this and became more stringent in medical evaluations. Time continued its slow march. 1947 became 1948. 1948 became 1949. Stalingrad prisoners, who had been young men in their 20s, were now in their 30s, aged beyond their years by starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Children born before the war were now 10 years old, growing up without fathers. Wives who had waited years began to remarry, believing their husbands dead. The prisoners, even if they eventually returned home, would return to lives that had moved on without them. In the camps, death continued, though at much lower rates than during the war years. But every death was particularly tragic now. Men who had survived the worst of the war dying just before liberation. The year 1949 brought significant change. The Soviet Union, under pressure from the newly formed East and West German governments and from international opinion, agreed to accelerate prisoner repatriation. In October 1949, coinciding with the establishment of the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, the Soviets announced that most German POWs would be released. The repatriations would occur in stages over the next several years. For Stalingrad survivors, this was the moment they had waited 6.5 years to hear. But the joy was tempered by reality. Of the 91,000 who had surrendered, perhaps 35,000 were still alive by late 1949. The repatriation process was bureaucratic and slow. Prisoners had to be documented, processed, and transported. Priority was given to those who had embraced communist ideology and would support East Germany's new government. Those deemed unreconstructed fascists or security risks were held longer. The Soviets wanted to ensure that returning prisoners wouldn't undermine the communist government in East Germany. Trains began carrying prisoners westward in late 1949 and through 1950. These journeys, though infinitely better than the death marches of 1943, were still difficult. Men were weak, traumatized, anxious about what awaited them at home. The first trainloads arrived at Frankfurt an der Oder on the German-Polish border in late 1949. The returning prisoners were shadows of the men who had marched into Stalingrad 7 years earlier. Journalist Margaret Bovary witnessed one repatriation train's arrival. She wrote, "They stepped off the trains looking decades older than their years. Men in their 30s looked 60. They moved slowly, carefully, as if their bodies might break. Most weighed perhaps 120 pounds. They wore Soviet-issue clothing because their German uniforms had rotted away years ago." The reunions with family were emotional and often difficult. Wives didn't recognize husbands. Children didn't recognize fathers. The men who returned were different people than those who had left. Many returnees struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares, anxiety, depression. They couldn't adjust to civilian life. They couldn't talk about what they had experienced because no one who hadn't been there could understand. German society was focused on its own recovery. There was limited sympathy for returning POWs, who were seen as reminders of a war most Germans wanted to forget. In East Germany, talking about Soviet camp conditions was politically dangerous. In West Germany, there was more freedom to discuss experiences, but also a desire to move forward rather than dwell on the past. Some returnees never readjusted. They committed suicide within months or years of returning home. Others turned to alcohol. Some became homeless, unable to hold jobs or maintain relationships. But repatriation continued. By 1950, perhaps 25,000 Stalingrad prisoners had been released. That left approximately 10,000 still in Soviet custody. These remaining prisoners fell into several categories. Some were being held on war crimes charges, real or fabricated. Some were considered security risks. Some were simply caught in bureaucratic limbo. The year 1953 brought hope. Stalin died in March, and his successors signaled a more lenient approach to prisoner repatriation. But releases remained slow and selective. West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer made prisoner repatriation a priority. He negotiated with Soviet leadership, offering diplomatic recognition and trade agreements in exchange for POW releases. In 1955, Adenauer visited Moscow and concluded an agreement. The Soviets agreed to release all remaining German POWs in exchange for West Germany establishing diplomatic relations with the USSR. The final major repatriation occurred in late 1955 and early 1956. Trains carried the last prisoners home, men who had been in Soviet custody for over a decade. Among these final returnees were perhaps 3,000 Stalingrad survivors. They were the last of the 91,000. They had survived 13 years since the battle, longer than some of them had expected to live in total. The final prisoner statistics are sobering. Of 91,000 who surrendered at Stalingrad, approximately 6,000 returned to Germany. That's a survival rate of 6.6%, or, viewed another way, a death rate of 93.4%. The causes of the 85,000 deaths broke down roughly as follows. 27,000 died during the death marches, February-April 1943. 35,000 died in transit camps, March-June 1943. 18,000 died in labor camps, 1943-1945. 5,000 died in camps after the war, 1945-1956. These numbers are estimates, as Soviet records were incomplete and often deliberately obscured. The true number who died might be higher. The question demands examination. Why did 93% of Stalingrad prisoners die in captivity? The answer is complex, involving multiple factors that compounded each other. First, the prisoners' physical condition at surrender was catastrophic. These men had already endured months of starvation, disease, and extreme cold during the siege. They surrendered as walking corpses. Many were beyond medical salvation, even with excellent care. A Soviet military doctor who examined prisoners in February 1943 reported, These men are in the final stages of dystrophy. Their bodies have consumed their own muscle tissue for energy. Their organs are failing. Even with immediate hospitalization and proper nutrition, I estimate 30 to 40% would die anyway. They're simply too far gone. Second, the sheer numbers overwhelmed Soviet logistics. The USSR had expected perhaps 40,000 prisoners. They got 91,000. The system wasn't prepared to handle that many people needing immediate medical care, food, and shelter. The Soviet Union itself was struggling with massive wartime shortages. Soviet citizens were starving. Soviet soldiers were on reduced rations. In this context, finding extra food for German prisoners was low priority. Third, Soviet policy toward German POWs was deliberately harsh. This wasn't entirely about resource shortages. It was about punishment and revenge. Soviet leadership viewed German prisoners as war criminals who deserved suffering as payment for what Germany had done to the USSR. Stalin himself set the tone. When told about high death rates among German POWs, he reportedly said, "They killed 27 million of us. If a few 100,000 of them die, it's justice." This attitude filtered down through the Soviet system. Camp administrators, guards, and officials had little incentive to improve prisoner conditions. Keeping prisoners alive was less important than extracting labor from them. Fourth, disease played a massive role. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and other infectious diseases spread rapidly through malnourished populations living in close quarters with poor sanitation. Once epidemic, these diseases were nearly impossible to control with 1940s Soviet medical capabilities. Fifth, the work requirements were deliberately excessive. Soviet labor camps operated on the principle that prisoner lives were expendable. Work quotas were set at levels that would exhaust healthy workers. For malnourished, diseased prisoners, the quotas were deadly. The calculation was cynical, but clear. Extract maximum labor from each prisoner before he dies, then replace him with another. Since the Soviets held over 3 million German POWs total, not just from Stalingrad, individual lives had no value. Sixth, winter was especially deadly. Prisoners lacked adequate winter clothing and shelter. Frostbite, hypothermia, and cold-related diseases killed thousands every winter. The Soviets could have provided better clothing but chose not to. Seventh, medical care was grossly inadequate. Camp doctors were overwhelmed, undersupplied, and often indifferent to prisoner suffering. Even prisoners who might have been saved with proper medical intervention died from treatable conditions. Eighth, the psychological toll cannot be discounted. Many prisoners simply gave up. The combination of physical suffering, separation from home, and hopelessness led to a form of psychological death that preceded physical death. Soviet doctors documented cases of prisoners dying with no clear physical cause. They had food, they weren't actively diseased, but they died anyway. Modern medicine would recognize this as psychogenic death, dying from despair. Ninth, age and pre-war health mattered. Younger, healthier prisoners had better survival rates than older or previously ill soldiers. But even the young and healthy faced terrible odds. Finally, there was an element of randomness. Some prisoners happened to end up in better camps with more humane administrators. Others ended up in the worst camps with brutal guards. Luck played a significant role in who lived and who died. Comparing German POW treatment in Soviet camps to Allied treatment of German POWs is instructive. German prisoners held by Americans, British, or French faced hardship, but their survival rates were above 95%. The difference wasn't primarily about resources, it was about policy and attitude. The Geneva Convention, which governed POW treatment, was systematically violated by the Soviets. The USSR had signed the convention, but never ratified it. Stalin argued that since Germany had violated international law in its treatment of Soviet POWs and civilians, the USSR was not bound by those laws in return. This created a cycle of brutality. Germans had treated Soviet POWs with horrific cruelty. Over 3 million Soviet POWs died in German captivity, a death rate of over 57%. The Soviets responded with similar cruelty toward German POWs. The men caught in this cycle were individual soldiers who may or may not have committed atrocities themselves, but who paid the price for their nation's crimes. The 6,000 men who returned from Soviet captivity after Stalingrad faced challenges that persisted for the rest of their lives. Coming home wasn't the end of their ordeal. It was the beginning of a different kind of struggle. Physical health problems plagued survivors for decades. Chronic malnutrition had permanently damaged organs and systems. Many suffered from digestive problems, unable to properly process food, even years after returning to adequate nutrition. Dental health was universally terrible. Years without proper nutrition or dental care meant survivors often had missing or rotten teeth. Many needed complete dental reconstruction. Respiratory problems from tuberculosis, pneumonia, and years breathing coal dust or working in harsh conditions affected many survivors. Lung damage was permanent. Frostbite's long-term effects included chronic pain in extremities, reduced circulation, and vulnerability to cold. Men who had lost fingers or toes to frostbite struggled with daily tasks. Psychological trauma was perhaps even more debilitating than physical damage. Survivors exhibited what we now recognize as severe PTSD, though that diagnosis didn't exist in the 1950s. Nightmares were universal. Survivors dreamed of Stalingrad, of the death marches, of the camps. They woke screaming, reliving horrors that wouldn't fade. Many survivors couldn't hold jobs. The discipline and routine of civilian employment was either impossible to manage or triggered camp memories. Unemployment and poverty affected many survivor families. Alcoholism rates among survivors were extremely high. Alcohol provided temporary escape from memories and psychological pain, but it also destroyed marriages, health, and financial stability. Family relationships were complicated. Wives had often remarried after years of no news, assuming their husbands dead. When prisoners returned, they found their wives with new husbands, their children calling another man father. Some families reunited, though the relationships were never the same. The man who returned wasn't the man who had left. Years of trauma had fundamentally changed him. Children who had been infants when their fathers left were now 10 or 12 years old. They had no memory of their father and related to him as a stranger. Building father-child relationships from scratch was difficult or impossible. Survivor guilt tormented many returnees. Why had they survived when 85,000 others died? What had they done differently? Had they collaborated? Had they stolen food from dying comrades? Had they survived at someone else's expense? These questions, whether grounded in reality or not, haunted survivors. Some concluded they didn't deserve to have survived and acted accordingly, destroying their own lives through self-destructive behavior. German society offered limited support. In the 1950s, there was no trauma counseling, no veteran support groups, no social acknowledgement that these men needed help beyond basic reintegration assistance. In East Germany, discussing Soviet camp conditions was politically problematic. The East German government was allied with the Soviet Union and didn't want to publicize Soviet brutality. Survivors who spoke too openly about their experiences faced social and professional consequences. In West Germany, there was more freedom to discuss camp experiences, but also a general societal desire to move past the war. Germans were focused on rebuilding and didn't want to dwell on the past. Survivors formed informal networks, connecting with other men who had been at Stalingrad or in Soviet camps. These connections provided some understanding and support, as only another survivor could truly comprehend what they had experienced. Some survivors found purpose in documentation. They wrote memoirs, gave testimony to historians, or participated in survivor organizations that collected accounts of what happened. This gave their suffering meaning and ensured the story wouldn't be forgotten. Others never spoke of their experiences. They locked away their memories and tried to live normal lives. Sometimes this worked. Often it didn't. The unprocessed trauma emerged in other ways. A few survivors emigrated, unable to live in Germany with its constant reminders of the war. They moved to South America, North America, or elsewhere, seeking a fresh start far from the past. As survivors aged, some found a measure of peace. Time dulled the sharpest edges of memory. Perspective came with age. Some made peace with their survival and their experiences. But for many, the trauma never fully healed. Men in their 70s and 80s still woke with nightmares of Stalingrad. The psychological scars remained until death. The last Stalingrad survivors died in the early 2000s. They took with them direct knowledge of what happened, leaving behind only their recorded testimonies and written accounts. The story of the 91,000 men who surrendered at Stalingrad and the 85,000 who never came home is more than just a tragedy of war. It's a case study in how military strategy, political decisions, and human cruelty combine to create catastrophic human suffering. These men were soldiers in an army that committed terrible crimes. The Wehrmacht participated in genocidal warfare on the Eastern Front. Many of these soldiers witnessed or participated in atrocities against Soviet civilians and prisoners. But that doesn't make their suffering less real or less worthy of historical documentation. Individual soldiers were caught in a system larger than themselves, and many paid with their lives for decisions made by leaders far from the front lines. The Soviet treatment of German POWs, while partially explained by German treatment of Soviet POWs, still represents a violation of international law and basic human rights. Two wrongs don't make a right, and the systematic brutality inflicted on German prisoners was itself a war crime. The story also reveals the limits of military glory and the reality of defeat. History often focuses on battles and heroes. Stalingrad is remembered for its strategic importance, for Soviet resilience, for the turning point it represented in World War II. But for the individual soldiers on the ground, Stalingrad meant cold, hunger, fear, death, and for those who survived the battle, years of unimaginable suffering in captivity. Their story reminds us that wars have consequences that extend far beyond armistice dates. The Second World War officially ended in 1945, but for these men, it continued for another 11 years. And for the survivors, it never truly ended at all. Today, memorials in Germany and Russia commemorate the Battle of Stalingrad. The city itself, now called Volgograd, has monuments and museums dedicated to the battle. But there are few memorials specifically for the 85,000 who died in captivity afterward. Their deaths were slower, less dramatic than those who died in combat, but they were no less real. Each of those 85,000 men was an individual with a name, a family, hopes, and dreams. They died far from home, often alone, buried in unmarked graves across the Soviet Union. Some of those graves have been found and marked. Many never will be. The vast expanse of the Soviet Union swallowed them, and their final resting places remain unknown. For the families left behind, closure was difficult or impossible. Without a body, without certainty, many families waited years before accepting that their husband, father, or son was never coming home. This is the brutal fate of Nazi soldiers captured at Stalingrad. 91,000 men who surrendered, 6,000 who returned, and 85,000 who never came home. Their story deserves to be remembered, not to glorify war or minimize anyone's suffering, but to fully account for war's human cost. To remember that behind every statistic is a human being, and behind every battle is an aftermath that continues long after the shooting stops.